Hello, I'm Dr. Karina Fernley. I work at University College London, and today I'd like to talk to you about tsunamis in Oman. So first of all, I'm going to explain to you what tsunamis actually are, and then we're going to look at what causes those tsunamis, and then we're going to be looking at how we can build early warning systems so that we can warn people about those tsunamis, and then finally we'll be looking specifically at the issue of tsunamis in Oman itself. So first of all, the key question is, what are tsunamis? Now, tsunamis comes from a Japanese word called harbour wave, and this comes from the idea that fishermen out to sea wouldn't see the wave of a tsunami, but as they came into a harbour, the wave would be amplified and it would become a harbour wave. It's not really a harbour wave, it's not a tidal wave. Actually, these are very, very different types of waves. They're very large waves that can exceed 200 kilometres in wavelengths, and they travel at around 450 miles per hour. So these are very different types of waves that we see in the ocean normally. So what is a tsunami? A tsunami is generally a hazard that's caused by the displacement of the water. It's an energetic shock to a significant water column, and this can happen in different ways. So most tsunamis will generate a number of different waves, typically 3 to 20 different major wave crests. And this is problematic because you have the initial wave hitting a community and then there'll be following waves hitting in a period afterwards. So where do tsunami sources occur? Well, we're going to be looking at 4 different types of tsunami sources. First are bolides, meteorites. Second are earthquakes. Then we've got volcanic sources. And then we've got the most common one, which is looking at seismic earthquake sources. And you can see from the diagram that we've got different coloured dots to depict the different types of places in which a tsunami is generated. And this map has a different scale from quite literally millions of years old right through to today. So there's different variances in types of age of these tsunami sources. So what causes tsunamis? Well, as I said, there's many different types, and we'll go through those step by step, but the most common type of tsunami is generated by an earthquake. Now, it's important to note that not every single earthquake will generate a tsunami. It has to have a number of different characteristics in order to create that tsunami. So first of all, the epicenter where the earthquake actually happens has to be beneath water. So it is able to displace that oceanic water or the water source on top of it. You also have to have a fault that creates some vertical movement, because without that vertical movement, we don't get the movement of that water column going up to generate the displacement that generates the waves of the tsunami. And on top of this, what we need is a pretty big earthquake. Smaller earthquakes will not generate very large tsunamis. It needs to be a substantial amount of displacement and energy. So we're looking at magnitudes above 7.5 on magnitude on the Richter scale. And generally we're looking at a shallow focus. So we're not thinking about earthquakes that are very deep. They generally have to be under 70 kilometres deep. So what we have is we have the plates subducting, and as it's subducting, that plate starts to capture on the subducting plate, and it will build up and rise up, and then at some point it will just flip back up again, and that flipping point creates the water to move and create the waves going out that way. So what happens is we see this very commonly in subduction zones, which is what we'll be seeing in Oman. So here I have a diagram to show what happened during the Indian Ocean tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, formed by the Sumatra-Andaman earthquake. And as you can see from this, you've got the event, the point source happening very quickly. Within 20 minutes or so, it hits Banda Aceh in Sumatra. But this wave then travels out across the whole of the Indian Ocean and in fact impacts Oman 6.5 hours later. But you can see it goes from everywhere from East Africa right through down to Australia, affecting those communities. And of course, over 230,000 people died from this tsunami. So it's an incredible experience, a very tragic experience, but one we can learn a lot from. So what about tsunami waves? What do they look like? Now, you may remember that in Sumatra and in places like Thailand, people were quite surprised by this tsunami wave, and that was partly because the water was drawn back away from the shore. And so many people, fishermen for example, would see that there was lots of fish out in the sea, and they would run along and try and capture all the fish, and unfortunately then the wave hit them. So what happened was that pullback of water was really the trough of the wave being drawn back and then the crest hitting as the wave hit the surface. Equally, sometimes the crest can hit you first, and we get this bore-like wave just coming towards you. And this is one like you can see on the slide of Japan, in Sendai in Japan in 2011. And here you can see that wave hitting the coastline like an absolute wall of water there. And unfortunately, you can see people staring at this wall of water as they're taken by surprise. So what causes this tsunami to create this huge typical wave that we see in tsunamis? Well, really what happens is out to sea, which is again coming back to the idea of the term tsunami, out to sea, that displacement creates a huge energy, but the ocean water is very deep. So the wave generated is actually quite small. So out to sea, you would hardly feel a tsunami wave. But as the coast starts to ramp up to the coastline, it gets shallower. And what happens is that the energy has to accommodate this shallowness. So what happens is the wavelengths get higher and higher and higher to the point that once it gets to the land, it creates a huge tall wave that then runs on land and creates what we call an inundation zone. So this ramping up is the key issue that creates the size, or the key parameter that defines the height of the wave and how hard it hits. So it's very important that we understand the morphology of the coastal environment to understand how tall the waves are going to be and how far it's going to run inland. Now the second type of tsunami source is actually that generated by landslides. And this happens all over the world in many locations, usually where the coastlines are fairly unstable. So we get these in submarine canyons and fan systems, in fjord areas, very active river deltas and volcanic islands. And these are places where there's lots of loose sediment that's being built up, and after a while it just can't be supported by its weight and it will just slump down. And that motion of slumping down will displace the water and again create a tsunami. This is quite different because it will generate very large tsunamis very near to the coastline, so they can be very, very devastating to the immediate community. Now the third type of volcano-generated tsunamis is that by volcanoes. So we have lots of volcanic islands around the globe, and these again are sources of material that can create landslides. But equally, when volcanoes erupt, they emit a lot of material, and that can displace water above it and then create a tsunami, as you can see on the right diagram. On the bottom left diagram, what you can see is a volcano erupting, and it's emitting a number of different hazards. Basically, it's emitting ash and tiny rock particles called tephra as part of pyroclastic flows. And these pyroclastic flows can flow into the water, into the sea, displace the sea, and again create a tsunami. Now this is of concern to Oman because there are a number of volcanic islands in the Indian Ocean, such as the Comoros and the Reunion Islands, and these have generated tsunamis in the past. So that's another potential threat of sources of tsunamis in Oman. The final source is not a particularly frequent source of hazard, but where we get extraterrestrial asteroids or bolides, they will hit the water, and this will then displace the water, creating a tsunami. And this really helps us understand how tsunamis work. So I'm sure you remember that when you were a little kid, you'd have a pebble and you'd throw it across a pond, and you could see it creating waves as it moves along and skips. And it's really that idea of the water the pebble hitting the water, creating these circles of ripples of waves, and that's the kind of tsunami that a meteorite will create. So when we think about tsunamis, we're interested in looking at the direction in which they go. Tsunamis can impact many different countries. It's an international hazard at the best of times. And so what we see is an elongation of the earthquake source drives the strongest tsunami at 90 degrees to which it actually occurs. So that's where we see most of the energy being shifted, at 90 degrees to the strike of the earthquake. Landslides are most powerful in the direction in which they slide. And of course, when we have any type of wave, it will refract around any shallower surfaces or islands. As you can see in this tsunami travel time map here, you can see that around Australia and Southeast Asia, the waves are starting to be refracted and move into different directions, and this causes concentrations in certain areas. So as I mentioned before, you can see this water recession as a precursor. So quite often with tsunamis, we're seeing this drawback, and you can see this in this diagram here of the beach in Sri Lanka, a huge 400-metre drawback of the tsunami wave before it then hits. And this is a really good example of an effective early warning for most tsunamis. But these tsunamis are very damaging. They come as a series of waves, and that can last several hours. And it's not just the tsunami wave that's coming in that can cause damage, it's actually that drawing back that can also pull debris and destroy buildings and then bring that out to sea, only to then be brought back in again, and then you have debris bashing against the buildings and the infrastructure, causing further damage. So quite often it's the second and third wave that can actually be far more devastating. So the intensity of that wave is really going to depend on how far the inundation depth is, so how far that tsunami goes in ground, the speed of it as it comes up onto the coastal shelf, onto the beach, and also the amount of debris that's within it. So for example, things like boats and shipping containers are commonly found, and these are pretty large structures that can cause quite significant damage and also be dangerous to people who are caught along the coastline. So ultimately, what we want to do is reduce the risks to tsunamis. Now, most deaths that we see in tsunamis as a result of drowning. And this is because most of the hazards that we see from tsunamis are flooding, but we also get contamination of drinking water, we also get fires from tanks and gas lines, and we also see a huge loss of critical infrastructure such as bridges and roadways, and also key facilities such as those of police to keep order, but also importantly medical facilities to deal with the injured populations. So there's all sorts of different signs that you can see on this slide that various countries have developed to show various evacuation routes that you can take to get to high ground from the coastland. This of course makes a key assumption that there is high ground that they can get to. So it's very important that if there isn't any high ground, that some form of engineering structure is made so that people can get to high ground. And this is what we call a vertical evacuation structure, so that people can actually climb up a building and be high enough so that if the tsunami hits underneath, they will be safe. So where do most of the tsunamis happen? Well, it's unsurprising that over 25% of tsunamis happen in the Pacific Ocean. It's the Ring of Fire, and we see plenty of plate tectonics going on. So here you can see that 18.6% of that is actually in the Japan and Russia region. But we can also see tsunamis all around the world, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the East Indies, and there's very important lessons we can learn about tsunamis in these different places. So now I want to talk about how we can build an early warning system. Now, early warning systems have been around for tsunamis for over 60 odd years, and this is partly because a warning system was set up in 1948 in the Pacific Ocean. And this was one of the first international warning centres that was created to generate warnings to all of those islands around the Pacific, centred with Hawaii in the middle. And they have a number of different stations that sit without the Pacific, and they are administrated by the American organisation of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Centre. Now, these guys issue different types of warnings. So they issue a first type of warning, which gives information to everyone in the Pacific. So that's that one centre giving that Pacific-wide warning. But then what will happen is that each country will then take that information and they will revise it and give their own national warning based on what they see the main risks and the hazards and how it's going to impact their coastline. And this is problematic because sometimes you can get conflicts in information, but generally it's taking that international system and then adapting it to a local level. Now, one of the key ways we can know that a tsunami has happened is not just by an earthquake, as most tsunamis are generated by an earthquake, but is actually through detecting that earthquake and the waves. So what we use quite commonly is a thing called a DART system. And what it is, you can see from this diagram, is you have a sensor at the bottom of the ocean, a seismometer that will measure earthquakes and be able to pick up that seismic energy. Equally, it will have some gas balls that will also be able to see what the pressure is of water. So if a wave is created, it will create a movement up and down. And that can be used again to verify that a tsunami wave has been generated. This information is then connected to a buoy that sits on the surface. And that buoy, the movement up and down, again can tell us whether a tsunami has been generated. It's a very different characteristic to what we see for oceanic waves. And then through telemetry, that information gets sent to the observatories and they download that data and are able to see what's going on. Now, what's important about DART machines is that they're very expensive and they need to be maintained. But also it takes time for that data to be collected, analysed and assessed. And in many cases, for near-field tsunamis, which we'll be talking about shortly, there's not enough time to actually give an effective warning. So tsunami hazards are something that requires a lot of effort in terms of looking at the technologies involved in warning, but equally doing a hazard assessment and saying, where can people evacuate to? Can they get to high ground, or do we need to build a vertical evacuation structure? We then have our warning system, but we also need to tell people, we need to prepare people so that they know if a tsunami was to happen or an earthquake was to happen, they would know what to do. They would know which signs to follow. And this requires lots of plans, it requires drills, and it requires the cooperation of all the authorities involved. So what happened following the Boxing Day tsunami was essentially the result of not having an early warning system. So many people died because there was actually no way of communicating the earthquake and the consequential tsunami. And this is really tragic because the tsunami took several hours to reach places like Thailand, and yet those people were taken by surprise. So what happened was that following this event in 2006, the UN set up this Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning Centre, and it consists of 25 seismographic stations that relays information to over 26 national tsunami information centres. But there's all sorts of problems with working on an international level, and it requires cooperation, investment in the equipment, and maintaining that information and relaying that information. And so there are several vulnerable and weak spots that need to be carefully looked at the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System so that it can become as effective as that of the Pacific Tsunami Warning System. Now, what we need to do, essentially, ideally, what we would like is to be able to model every single tsunami and say, if a tsunami was to happen, it would hit this coastline and it would be this height in this area and this height in this bay down the road here. And that's what insurance companies are really interested in. They want to know how high the wave's going to be, how far inland it is, so that they can set their policies at the right level and reduce their loss. And although we can understand propagation quite well as the wave goes up the coastline, the challenge is actually knowing that coastline. That coastline is changing all the time due to erosion. We're also having different parameters of scale of events. For example, we're seeing with climate change, we're seeing more energy in different types of hazards, and we're seeing sea level rises change. So all these different parameters are changing that make it difficult for us to know exactly how high a tsunami is going to be. So it's a very difficult thing to model at a resolution that's actually that useful for planning. And also what we see is the refraction along the coastline, like we saw before with the waves going around Australia. You have that along every single bay area as well. So it's a very, very complicated thing. And that's why we can see one wave with run-up heights of, say, 15 metres in one area and 2 metres in another. This accounts for that variance. So you can see that tsunamis start to get quite complicated and there's a lot of things that are unknown. But actually in practice, there's some really simple things that we can do. First of all, there's the element of feeling, touch. Your feet will feel the earthquake. If there's an earthquake, you can sense that there's probably going to be a tsunami, so you can take precautionary action and get to high ground. Equally, if you see the water withdrawing, you can see that maybe that disappearance of water will lead to a tsunami. And then finally, if you can hear a sound, much like a train, with a roar of water coming towards you, again, that is another sign that a tsunami is approaching. So the key thing here is when you're in that situation, is not to necessarily wait for evacuation orders, but be educated and trained to know what to do in response to those different senses that you can pick up, those tsunami hazards. There's another thing that we can do, which is to engineer structures so that when the tsunami hits, it doesn't cause the building to collapse. And we can see this by raising buildings up with sturdy structures so that the wave can move underneath. Of course, what we need to do is make sure that those buildings are not just able to survive the tsunami, they also need to survive the earthquake. So you can see in the second diagram, there's cross bracing there to keep the structure upright during the earthquake as well. So there's all sorts of ways that we can retrofit buildings and make them safer so they can survive tsunamis and earthquakes. But of course, they will only work up to the limit as to which they're designed, at which point they will fail. So what's really important is we have to make sure that our design principles are effective. And you can see in the two photos there, one example of a well-designed building and around it a load of non-well-designed buildings that are flattened and didn't perform very well. So it does show that actually engineering can be very effective. So what about tsunamis in Oman? How can we apply all this information to the country of Oman? Well, you may be familiar with the fact that in 1945, an 8.1 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of eastern Makran and affected everyone around the Gulf of Oman. Approximately 4,000 people are thought to have died, although none of them are thought to have died in Oman itself, but it affected Iran, Oman, Pakistan and parts of northwest India. There is some debate as to whether the tsunami was generated by the earthquake or whether the earthquake created a landslide that then created the tsunami, because essentially it took about 45 minutes to reach Oman. And we'll see how actually, if it was just an earthquake, that could have been much quicker. So let's look at the tectonic environment of Oman. So here we have the Arabian plate that is slowly in the northeast part subducting underneath the Eurasian plate. This is along the Alpine Himalayan range. And so what we have is the oceanic plate of the Arabic plate subducting underneath the continental crust of the Eurasian plate. And this is happening pretty slowly. It's happening at around 20 to 30 millimetres per year. So very, very slowly. Now we can see evidence of tsunamis all around the Middle East. So here is a table that shows the different types of tsunamis that we've seen around the Arabian Peninsula. So you can see that there are some from Oman, but we can also see many that have been triggered from Indonesia, affected by the Chagos Islands, and so on. So what's special about the Makran seismic zone, which I've abbreviated as MSZ here, is here we have a diagram that shows the different earthquakes that have happened between 1973 and 2015. And you can see on the western part of the western region highlighted, there's quite a lot of earthquakes there, very shallow. But what we're interested is that region that's highlighted between the western and eastern region. Now you can see on the eastern side of the Makran zone, there's quite a lot of seismic activity, as on the western side, there seems to be less activity. And these are really the areas that will cause a tsunami to happen. As we go north, there's a zone where very deep earthquakes happen, but this does not happen above ocean. It happens above land, so it will just generate an earthquake and not create a tsunami. So the key question is that we're seeing quite a lot of earthquake activity on the eastern side and not much on the western side. So there's all sorts of research that's being done now to have a look at why this is. And it's actually thought that because of the very slow subduction of the plate underneath here, it's actually building up stress very, very slowly. And it can take around 2,000 years for actually the point to which it will flip up and then create a tsunami. So we think that these kinds of earthquakes can happen every 2,000 years. And when we say these kinds of earthquakes, we're talking about very large earthquakes, say a magnitude 9. So what we're looking at is an event that's comparable to that of Sumatra in Indonesia and the Boxing Day tsunami. So if we were to take that worst case scenario, you could see what would happen is this earthquake happening in the western part of the Makran zone, which is right opposite where the coasts of Oman is. And it's thought in a worst case that would unzip and fault along the whole 1,000-kilometre length of the Makran seismic zone. If that were the case, you can see in the bottom diagram as to the inundation that would happen along the coastline. So we're looking at here something like a 25-minute warning, and we're looking at generally waves of at least 5 metres. But of course, as I explained before, this will be higher in some areas and lower in others, depending on that topography of the coastline. So let's perhaps look at something that we might be able to understand a bit better. And this scenario is taking the 1945 event, the same magnitude, but moving it slightly west from where it actually happened. And you can see on this map the inundation zone marked by the red line. And as you can see in the top map, we've got that scenario of a Makran event happening on the western side with a run-up of about 5 metres along the coastline. The diagram below shows what would happen if we were looking at that worst case scenario. So we're looking at that magnitude 9 event along the whole rupture of the fault zone. And that would create inundation and run up, well, much larger inundation that you can see there with the red line, and also the run up of about 17 metres. The red star is put there on purpose because that is where the early warning system and centre sits in Oman at the Muscat airport. So that's something to consider, is that that centre will be affected by the tsunami, even if it's a relatively small scale. We're not talking about the worst case scenario there. Now this diagram shows the different travel times for near-field tsunamis. So near-field tsunamis are tsunamis that are created near to Oman. So like we're looking with the Makran zone, here you can see that we're looking at less than 30 minutes warning for a tsunami. Of course, when we're looking at tsunamis that are generated in the far field, like in Indonesia, we'd get up to 6.5 hours worth of warning. And that's enough time to do something. 30 minutes warning is not a lot of time, and this has a huge consequence for how people can respond to the tsunami. So Oman rightly has started to become quite concerned about the potential impact of a tsunami and began operating an early warning system in early 2015. It's part of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning Centre as well and receives those warnings. Knowing that a potential tsunami could be over 5 metres high in the northeastern part of Oman is a pretty significant event. The planning would have to occur to accommodate for the low-rise buildings along the Omani coast. It's thought that these smaller types of earthquakes and tsunamis may occur as often as 125 to 250 years. And of course, nowadays, unlike 1945, that coastal area is highly developed and with much larger populations. Now you may think, okay Karina, we've got 30 minutes for a warning, but actually there's quite a few limitations to this warning. It's very difficult to know exactly where the earthquake is, to know exactly how big it is, and this is really important for us to determine how big the tsunami is going to be. And this was the key problem in Japan because they underestimated the size of the Tohoku earthquake, and consequently the tsunami was much bigger than they expected or planned for. The DART sensor in Oman is actually placed near south of Karachi, so it may not pick up the tsunami wave until it's actually hit in Oman. And of course we've got DART cables and all sorts of pressure equipments that are out to sea measuring this equipment, but those cables can be affected by earthquakes and landslides. So one of the only ways we can confirm a tsunami is going to be generated within a 30-minute timescale is when that wave actually hits the coastline. So as I said before, the most important thing is education so that people can self-warn and evacuate in a safe way. And this is through the ground shaking from earthquakes. So this is why education programs are really important. It's also very important to have clearly signed evacuation routes and to build seismically resistant buildings and tall ones that are able to cope with tsunami hazards. It's also important that you start to think about where your critical infrastructure is. Perhaps not having the early warning centre in the key zone that may affect, or having a backup centre, is something that might be wanted to consider in the future when doing future urban planning. But it's also thinking about where your hospitals are. Are they going to be affected? Where's your search and rescue teams? Where will they be located at the time of a potential tsunami? Because if they're affected, they won't be able to respond. And also there's a need to consider any flood defences along the coastline and how that may actually make the tsunami wave impact further inland, so you get a longer inundation area. So what does this mean when we're looking at the social implications? The people that are going to be affected by a tsunami. You're going to have all sorts of blockage by the debris that's picked up during the tsunami, and the debris largely will come from the earthquake itself, which will damage buildings. There's going to be all sorts of gridlock as people will try and evacuate and get in their cars and get to safety. There'll be buildings that could collapse during an earthquake, and there'll be people stuck inside where people will want to help and save people. And that creates a concern if you're going to have a large wave hit them within a 20-minute time frame. And of course, it's very important to consider at what time this event's happening. If it's happening at school time, parents will obviously want to go to school to check their children are all right. Equally, if it happens at night, people may be sleeping and may not be aware of what's going on for a while. There's all sorts of social implications that come from this. And what does this mean for responding? Well, it's going to limit the capability to respond. There's going to be a significant impact on the infrastructure, the main roads, health, hospitals, business, and the rescue services. You may also lose your power sources. You may also lose damage to the water salination plants, to ports and marinas. There may be ships that are brought inland quite a few kilometres. Key infrastructure such as roads and airports may also be impacted, as well as key cultural and tourist sites. Communication itself may be severely disrupted, with networks and mobile networks not functioning properly or overloaded. And there will be foreigners and tourists that could be vulnerable along the coastline, including places such as Muttra, who may not understand what's going on. Will they be able to read the signs if they're in Arabic or English? Or if you've got a Chinese tourist, will they be able to understand? So these are the kinds of considerations and complexities that are involved. On top of this, in terms of Oman, there's concern about the oil refinery along the coastline and the fact that you may get oil spillages and or there's a potential for petroleum-fueled fires as a result of the earthquake and tsunami. Of course, this is focused very much on Muscat, but other coastal towns and cities will be affected. And let's not forget that any significant tsunami would impact all the neighbouring countries. So everyone would have to deal with the consequences of the event. So what can we learn from all these tsunamis, from the Boxing Day at Sumatra tsunami in 2004 to Hokkaido 2011? There's lots of things that we can take away that are important lessons to take on board. First of all, it is important to have early warning systems, but people need to know how to respond to those early warning systems. We know that far-field tsunamis that give us ample time can give us time to respond effectively. The problem is when we have a near-field tsunami, it gives us a very short amount of time to respond. So what we need to do is make sure that we can continue to improve our hazard science, hazard understanding of earthquakes and tsunamis so that we can improve those warning systems. But we also need to make sure that we work together with our mitigation strategies and that they account for the fact that you're going to have very short notice. We need to use these lessons from past mistakes to update early warning systems constantly and make sure that they're effective and that they work properly for the population at risk. One of the last things that's very difficult is to deal with tsunamis that are generated by landslides. And these have happened frequently in Earth's history, although not so frequently in our recent history, as there's no real way of being able to detect every single landslide. So you have to be prepared for the fact that you may also not have a warning of a tsunami. So there are really effective ways that we can mitigate against tsunamis. And what I've done here is given a list of references that you can take a look at for further information. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you found the lecture interesting, and I wish you all the best of luck with the scenario. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting.